Welcome to video number 2 of the automatic to manual swap on Mark 4 VW. This video is going to cover as much of the wiring as I can. The wiring is probably the most intimidating part. The mechanical issues anybody can figure out, you look up in the manual. But on the wiring, there's a whole lot of wiring bundles that you're going to be cutting into, and you'll need to run some new circuits. So let's get started looking at some of these electrical circuits we're working on. Before you start tearing apart the electrical circuits on your car, get familiar with the electrical wiring diagrams and figure out which diagrams apply to your car, because the year and the options and the types of equipment can make the color coding of the wiring different and can even change the pins. So make sure you can find the wiring diagram in your manual for your specific car so you can confirm those circuits before you start cutting wires that go to your ECU. We have 4 different circuits that we have to work with when we're swapping from the automatic transmission to the manual. First is the reverse lights. We have to rewire that circuit for the sensor on the manual transmission. We have since we got to add a clutch pedal, we have to put a sensor on the clutch pedal for the cruise control so that the cruise control will turn off when you push that clutch in. Number 3 is the clutch safety switch, so that the car won't start until the clutch is pressed in. And then the 4th one depends on which automatic transmission you're using. It's the speed sensor or VSS system. The 01M automatic transmission is almost the exact same as both of the manuals, so you really don't have to do any work with it. But the 09A and 09G, the tiptronic transmissions, it's a completely different circuit. Transmission has an internal speed sensor, the G68 sensor, that sends the signal to the TCU. From the TCU, it goes to the instruments so that it reads out inside the car how fast you're going. And then from the instrument panel, it actually comes back to the ECU so that the ECU knows how fast you're going. And all of those components need to know how fast the car is going to do their computations for what you need. When you switch to a manual, what we're trying to make the circuit do is an external sensor that sticks into the transmission. We want to take the signal from that, send it to the gauges or the instruments, and then from the instrument panel come back to the ECU, because we need both those gauges and the ECU to know how fast we're going. So for this particular car, I took pin 56 from the TCU, the transmission control unit, cut that wire off, cut pin 35, and soldered those 2 wires together. So now the wire that I'm going to use down for the transmission sensor will send that signal up through the plenum chamber connectors and into the cab and to the instrument clusters. And that completes anything that I needed from the wiring harness of the TCU. So then I could pull the TCU out, which is on the passenger side, right? The ECU is almost center of the car, and the TCU, the transmission control unit, is over by your cabin air filter. So now you're done with that. That can go away. You can cut the harness off, but I cut it fairly close to the TCU so that I have this wire bundle left over to choose those wires to use for creating other circuits that I need to do, as we were talking about with the reverse lights, the cruise control, and the clutch safety switch. So here's the 2 connectors that we cut off of the automatic transmission. On the left there, the big one is the 20-pin connector, and then on the right is the 8-pin connector. So on the 20-pin connector, the only wire that we are going to use is that white one right there, which we're now using for a signal wire. So more about that here in a minute. Let's talk about power and ground first. So here's the 8-pin connector that goes on the front of the automatic transmission. So this is going away, but we need 3 of the wires out of this. So we're going to take pin number 2, which you can see I've already taken out, and that's a green and black wire, and that's a constant power, and we're going to need that for both of the circuits that we're putting in down here in the engine bay. So we're going to solder a Y on there so we have 2 power wires. Then pin 3, which is on this other side here, you can see pin 3 is missing. That's a red with a skinny yellow stripe. That's the other end of that red with skinny yellow stripe that we're going to use as a signal wire here. And then at pin 6 is a brown wire, which I pulled out, and that's simply a ground. Okay, so the 3 wires that we take out are going to go to the 2 new plugs that we're adding. So we'll start with the reverse light. Here's the reverse light switch connector that goes on the manual transmission. So this one is now wired. And there, let me see if I can get it without shaking. There's the black with the green stripe that we cut out of pin number 2 on the automatic transmission 8-pin connector. And here's the other end of that red with the skinny yellow stripe that came from the relay inside the cab, up underneath the dashboard. All right, so now when this is plugged into the transmission and the transmission is put in reverse, it closes that switch or connects the switch. So basically it connects those 2 pins that we're looking at here, and we'll have power flowing from that black with the green stripe wire to the red with the skinny yellow wire, and that will provide power to our reverse lights. We only have 1 power wire here, so that black with green stripe wire, I actually soldered a Y into it right where it comes out of the harness here, because I need a power wire for each of these connectors that we're talking about. So the reverse light connector has been covered, and now this 3-pin connector, is for the VSS, and we already talked about the white wire that came out of the 20-pin connector on pin 6. All right, and that's what we're using as our signal wire, which is pin 2. Oh, let's flip it over so we can see the pin numbers. Focus. There we go. Okay, pin 2 is the signal wire. So it's blue with white, but then it solders into the white. Okay, and then the ground that we cut off the transmission 8-pin connector goes into pin 3 here. That's the brown wire on the left. That's your ground. And then the other half of that Y for the power goes into pin 1. So now pin 1 is powered. Pin 2 is signal from the VSS to the gauges, and pin 3 is ground. So now we have our transmission circuits all complete in the engine bay. As you're doing this harness, make sure you leave the VSS connector long enough, because that actually has to go all the way back here to the back of the transmission, and you have to route around the front of the transmission a little bit here. So you want to make sure you leave yourself plenty. But that concludes the circuits that we needed to connect here and in the engine bay. So here's the diagram I made myself using the Bentley manual. And what I have depicted is the TCU here at the top left with the pins that we're going to have to deal with, the ECU with the 2 pins that we're going to have to deal with. This kind of blocked off area represents the plenum chamber connectors, and we have the orange T10, the blue T10, and the white T10 connector to deal with. The numbers inside represent the pin numbers. And then here at the right top is the instrument panel, which has 2 connectors on the back, 2 T32 connectors, and we're talking about the blue connector here with 2 pins that we're going to have to deal with, pin number 3 and pin number 28. This is the blue clutch switch that we've added to the clutch pedal, or that we're going to add to the clutch pedal. This represents inside the engine compartment, right? That's the automatic transmission connector, the 20-pin connector. And then this is the 3-pin VSS connector that we're gonna add on the manual transmission. One caution that I'll give you is particularly for this diagram. I'll show you another diagram in a minute that it's the same between different years. But this diagram is written for a 2004 1.8 with the automatic transmission. So if you have a 2003 or you have an engine different than, it happens to be the AWP 1.8, it might be different on a different 1.8 engine. It'll be different on the VR6, the 2.0 or the TDI. So what I'm driving at is this diagram won't necessarily work for everybody. So before you go cutting any wires and soldering stuff together, you got to double check in your manual for your year, your engine, and your transmission what the color codes and pin numbers are. So that's my disclaimer. I'm going to start in the engine bay here on the left-hand side. The 20-pin connector that goes to the automatic transmission, that's the big round one, has a white wire that travels up past the battery, up past the plenum chamber, and all the way over to the passenger side of the plenum chamber to the TCU, and joins to pin 35. Now, there are a huge bunch, there's actually half of those 20 wires do that routing. So you could use any of those wires. But I chose the white one on pin number 6 because pin number 6 is what actually carries the signal for the speed sensor that's the, I believe it's the G68 that's internal in the automatic transmission. So I'm just trying to stick as close to factory color codes as I can. So that's why I chose the white wire. So factory, that's how that wire goes. So in the engine bay, we're gonna cut that off and solder it to pin number 2 for the connector that we are adding to go onto the VSS. So now we have the signal coming from the manual transmission the way it should up into the plenum chamber and go into the TCU. But we're gonna take that TCU out. So we've got to change the wiring here. So pin 56 is the pin that the TCU in an automatic car supplies signal for speed to the instrument panel. Pin 56 on the blue and lilac wire comes to the blue T10 connector at pin 10, goes through that firewall, the wire coloring code switches to green, and it continues up to pin 28 on the instruments. So the instruments are looking for that signal on pin 28 on that green wire. Right? That circuit exists in an automatic car. So all we're going to do is we're going to cut that blue lilac wire and we're going to cut that white wire up in the plenum chamber and join those two together. So that's 2 connections we've made, and now we have the manual transmission providing signal through the white wire, changes to the blue lilac where we made the solder, goes to the T10 connector in the plenum chamber, the blue T10, and then continues up to pin 28 on the instruments. So now we have signal going from the transmission for speed to the instrument panel. The ECU normally receives signal on pin 54. It comes from the TCU off of pin 63 on another blue and lilac wire and continues to pin 54. So what we're going to do here is take that pin 63 from the TCU, cut it, all right, and the other end we know goes to the TCU, and then take that blue and lilac wire that's coming out of the orange T10 at pin 6, and we're going to solder those together. So that makes this circuit go away. And now we have pin 3 from the instruments supplying speed signal through the orange T10 at pin number 6 through the firewall going into the ECU at pin 54. So now the ECU is getting its speed signal. One more circuit that we need to wrestle with here is for the cruise control cancel switch, the blue clutch switch. The circuit already exists in this car off of pin 39 from the ECU. That's where the signal comes. It's actually just providing power. Right? Power comes through this red and white wire down to pin 4 on the T10, the white T10 connector in the plenum chamber. That wire already exists even in the manual car. So that makes our life easy. All we have to do now is add a wire that goes from the blank pin at pin 4 on the car side and run that down underneath, so when we put the clutch in, we're gonna wire that to one of the connectors on the blue clutch switch. So this circuit here, we have to add. I happen to have an old harness from a car that I had parted out, so I was able to pull a pin with a wire on it and just pop that pin into that T10 connector up from underneath the dash. If you don't have that, there's other ways around it. You could just solder a wire on here in the plenum chamber and let it hang down and then go around in the car and add that wire to the blue clutch switch. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. I liked using the pins because now everything is as the factory builds it. And if you're troubleshooting it later, it's easy to go in, and if I use a white and red wire, then the color coding stays the same, and life is a little bit simpler. But you don't have to. There are other ways around it. So that's the circuits that we need to work in the plenum, coming through the plenum chamber and up by the ECU and the TCU. So here's the wiring diagram for the engine bay connections that we need to do. Just for orientation, here's the fuse box that's obviously in the car. The starter relay, which we haven't talked about, but I need to use a couple wires from it. That'll be the next diagram. That is under the dash. And then there's a ground. Doesn't matter where, but we'll get to the pin assignment here in a sec. In the engine bay, you have two connectors on the 09A transmission. You have the 20-pin connector, which we've already talked about, and we have the 8-pin connector, which we need 3 of the wires off of that. So that 20-pin connector I keep talking about, physically, that's it there. It looks like that. Then you have the 8-pin connector, and it's kind of the standard VWD shape with obviously 8 wires coming out of it. So that's this 8-pin connector. What we're gonna add with the manual transmission is a 3-pin connector that is shaped just like the 8-pin connector, but there's only 3 connections in it, and then a 2-pin connector. The 3-pin connector is for the VSS, or the speed sensor that goes on the back of the manual transmission. The 2-pin connector is the backup switch that goes on the front. And so that's the switch that when you put the transmission into reverse, it'll turn on the backup lights. So we already talked about taking the white wire off of pin 6 on the 20-pin connector and connecting that. We're using that for signal now for the VSS. So that goes to pin 2. So we make that connection as per that last diagram. But we still need power and ground to this VSS connector. So we're going to get power from pin 2 of the automatic 8-pin connector. But there's a catch here because we're going to need power over here also. So we're going to do both those circuits at the same time. Pin 2 is a black with green stripe wire that's positive 12 volt that's ignition switched. You can check it, right? Make sure you're getting the right one by turning the key on and putting your voltmeter, your multimeter, to that black and green wire. Should be 12 volts. So we're going to trim that wire, we're going to cut that wire, and we're going to put a 3-way connection on it. All right, we can make that by just twisting 3 wires together and soldering them up. But we're going to need to join that to positive power at pin 1 on the VSS connector, and we need that here to one of the connectors on the manual backup switch. It doesn't matter which pin you use on the manual backup switch. If you switch these pins, it'll still work the same. It's a simple switch that's either open or closed or open. Now, we have an option for this next signal that we need to get from the manual backup switch into the starter relay, because we're going to do some wiring. Our third diagram we haven't got to yet is doing this starter relay inside the car. You have an option here. You can either use the yellow and blue line that comes to pin 7 on the 8-pin connector, or you can use the yellow and red. Before you solder these up, I would just twist them together and then go into the car, and we'll do that next relay, the next diagram in relay, to make sure you're getting the right wire. There are multiple yellow with blue wires. There's one in this bundle, there's one in this bundle, and there's a couple others. So you got to make sure you're getting the right wire. And then the same with the yellow to red. So in this diagram, I'm going to use the yellow to red, but I'm just pointing out that you could use this yellow and blue if you wanted to. So I'm going to cut this wire. I'm actually going to cut it at the connector, so I leave more wire to use. Bring that over, past all these others, and connect that at pin 2 on that backup switch. One more connection we need to make in here, and that's to get ground to our VSS. Pin 6 on the auto 8-pin connector is a brown wire that goes to ground. Again, you can check that with a continuity with an ohm meter. Make sure you're getting ground on it. Cut that wire and bring that over. Connect it to pin 3 at the VSS. So that's your wiring in the engine bay. The connection's actually on the transmission. Once you get those made, you can clip the rest of those wires and take those 2 connectors out. So now the hard part is getting up under the dash and taking out, there's one 175 relay that controls those circuits with the exception of the VSS underneath in the relay panel. So we got to take the knee panel out, take the lower dash out so we can see, and then we're going to take that out, pop that relay out, and repurpose some of those circuits. So here we are looking down into the underneath the dash inside the car. You can see that I've already put in the clutch pedal, but I would recommend to do all your wiring before you put the clutch pedal in, so you have a little more room to work, because it can be a real pain getting up in here and soldering and working wires, trying to find wire connections. So with your kit or with the equipment that you got for your swap, you have 2 switches that go on the clutch panel. One of them is white with a black connector, and one of them is blue. And that's for the clutch safety switch and the cruise control interrupt. So what we're going to do is we're going to find our 175 relay, which is a 9-pin relay, and we're going to repurpose a bunch of the circuits on it, and then we'll replace what's left with a 53 relay, which is basically a standard 4-prong standard relay. So you can get these at the junkyard for a couple bucks. You can order them from just about any of the suppliers. They shouldn't run you more than $10. So once you find your 175 relay, pull that connector out the back. Let me try this way so the light's on it. So here's my 175 relay. And we have all these circuits go back through the back. Numbers on this guy. You have to get the light just right, and I have to use a magnifying glass. But for example, you can see the little raised letters in there, if I can get it to focus. So the upper right hand corner there is pin 1, 2 is the next one down, 3 the next one down, 4 at the top in the middle, 5 in the very center, etc., etc. And then I usually just go ahead and mark them with a pen on the outside for easy reference as I'm going. Because every time I'm trying to read those pins, it drives me nuts. Once you get all that wiring done, then you're just going to plug your 53 relay in, and then you can button up all the wiring in here, put the relay panel back on, make sure the wires are tucked up so they don't catch in the pedals as the pedals flip, right, or on your brake. And then put your switches in, right? The blue one goes on the bottom, and the white one goes up on top. And then you should have your wiring done. All right, these are labeled right on the face here. The little numbers are really hard to see, so I usually take a permanent marker and write them on the side because I'm constantly reconfirming those pin numbers as I'm cutting wires. Okay, so let's go to the diagram and see what we need to do with that relay connector. Several things we need to do. So the first one we're going to talk about is the reverse lights. And that's actually a little bit, that's the trickiest connection. So pin 4 here on the connector is a black with blue, which you're never going to see in this light. All right, but that's my number 4 connector there. On the diagram here, pin 4, black wire with a blue stripe. That goes to the reverse lights. So we're going to cut that, but we're going to leave a pretty good pigtail on there. We're not going to cut it right at the connector. We're going to cut it long because we have two things to do with that wire. The first is we take the pin that is coming out of the relay connector and we're going to connect that to one leg on our white or gray clutch switch. It's the safety switch. So we're going to make one connection there, and that's why we got to leave that pigtail on pin number 4. The other end of that blue wire, we're going to connect to the wire that we decided to use in the last diagram off the transmission 8-pin connector. Okay, in the last diagram, I decided to use the yellow and red wire from pin number 3 here. So here's pin number 3, is that corner there, and there's my yellow-red wire. So clip that wire, and before you solder it, you want to continuity check that connection to the clip that you did in the engine bay in the last step. Okay, you can use this yellow and blue wire. The reason I recommend you continuity check these is because there is multiple yellow with blue stripe wires in the engine bay and multiple yellow with red stripe wires. So confirm that you're getting the right wire before you start soldering stuff together. And the easiest way to do that is just use your ohm meter and do a continuity check. Once you've confirmed that is the correct wire, we're going to connect this black with blue wire up underneath the dash to this wire that we just cut off. Since we left that pigtail long so that we could make this connection is going to be up underneath the dash further. So that's a little bit harder connection to make. So that connects our reverse lights to the switch that we did the wiring in the last step in the engine bay. So now that switch will provide power straight into the reverse lights. Continuing on with the clutch safety switch, we're going to go to pin 7 on the relay connector. Cut that, and this one you can cut right at the relay connector. But for ease, I'm going to depict it as here. And that connects to ground. If you like, you can ohm meter that out to make sure it's a good ground. But now we have a ground through that safety switch from pin number 4. Okay, pin number 5, which is that center pin, is a black with green stripe. All right, we messed with another black with green stripe in the engine bay, but this is a different one. Okay, as it is factory, that pin comes to the fuse box, and that's 12 volt positive power. We're going to cut that wire, and you can cut it right at the connector. So you can take that out, and we're going to connect that to the other leg of the blue clutch switch, and that is the cruise control switch. In the last step, we connected a white and red wire to pin number 4 on the white T10 connector in the plenum chamber, which then has a pin that goes, a wire that goes to pin 39 on the ECU. So through that blue clutch switch for the cruise control, we now have switch 12 power going to pin 39 on the ECU. And that will tell the ECU when to turn the cruise control on and off, whether that clutch is in or out. Okay, very important here, pins 2, 6, and 8, don't touch them. Leave those pins, we need them the way they are. So if you'll notice on your standard relay, the 53 relay that we're going to plug in there, there's 4 pins, and they are going to plug into 2, 6, 8, and 4. So if you leave wires connected in 9 or 1 and 3, or 1 or 3, it doesn't matter. They won't be connected to anything, so you can just leave those wires there. You don't have to worry about cutting them and taping them up. So now this start relay is going to function that it has positive 12 volts coming in on pin 2, a heavy duty red wire. We have power coming from the ignition switch on pin 6. So when the clutch is depressed and you turn on the ignition switch, that connects power through that clutch safety switch, which will activate this relay, and power will come from pin 2 down to pin 8 to your starter. So this becomes the starter relay up underneath the dash. This wiring diagram, fortunately, is the same through all the years that I've looked up and diagrammed out, and between a VR6, the 1.8, TDI, etc. The color codes can change on different years, right? Those wires might be a different color, but the pin assignments are the same. So you can use this diagram on any of the Mark IVs. You just got to double check and use your ohm meter where appropriate to make sure that you're getting the right wire, because the wire colors change. It also stays the same whether you have an 09A automatic or an 01M automatic, whereas the previous diagram only works for the 09A automatic transmission. So how did I come up with those diagrams? It takes a little bit of time. So here's looking at my Bentley manual, and you have to find the correct diagram for your year and options of car. So for this diagram is for the 1.8 with the 09A transmission, 2004 and 2005 in this case. You have to look in the index so that you get to the right diagram. In this diagram, you can see this dotted line and this solid line. And the cool thing is, as per the notes, that dotted line represents how the wiring goes in a automatic transmission car. The solid lines is what everything has or the manual has. So in this diagram, this gray box represents the ECU. J217 here represents the TCU. Here's the T10 connector in the plenum chamber. You can see in the automatic transmission, it's that dotted line. So we have the car that has that wire running this way. And what we need to get is the wire running this way. So those diagrams that we just went through is simply a process of looking through the manual and figuring out what we have and where we need to get it. So basically, we need to make this dotted line match what that solid line is. And reading the notes, you can figure out which T10 connector this is, which pin connector that is. You can follow that line into the correct diagram. Here's another example of where the dotted line and the solid lines. All right, so the automatic car has this dotted line, and the manual car has that solid line. So that diagram, here's the speed sensor with pins 1, 2, and 3, as we talked about in my diagram. So that's where we were cutting this wire and taking it down to the speed sensor. And that will make that into this. So you need to confirm that for your year and options and type of transmission. Like I said, these diagrams and this one in particular, here, let me, just for reference, I'll show you that this is diagram 16 of 78. You need to learn how to read these diagrams and decipher all this information, such as pin numbers and color and wire size and where that wire physically is. If you know that there's a wire that goes from the TCU into the cabin, that's great. But where is it physically? When I go to look in the plenum chamber, how do I find that wire? And this diagram will help you figure that out. So make sure that you confirm those color codes and pin numbers for your particular car before you go blindly following the diagrams that I've shown you. Thanks for watching. That's my process on figuring out the wiring for doing the automatic to manual swap. Honestly, that step is the hardest and most intimidating and most painstaking and takes the most time. And I hate soldering upside down up underneath the dash. That's kind of a pain. You don't want solder dripping in your face, and you don't want to burn your carpet, so make sure you put a mat down or something. Once you've got that done though, it's all downhill. Putting the transmission back in and the pedal in and all those mechanical pieces, that's fairly easy stuff. You've probably already done it before. So this is kind of the big step. And this is what makes everything work right once you get that new transmission in. So again, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe so when I get video number 3 out of putting everything back together, you'll be notified as soon as I get that posted. And I can use the support so that I can keep making these videos and bringing you this content on YouTube.